The snow in Montana doesn't just cover the dead, it preserves them, freezing their last expressions of terror or regret. On the night of October 14th, 1887, the wind howled through the Bitterroot Valley like a grieving widow, carrying with it the scent of pine and fresh blood. Susanna Miller thought she was traveling west to find a husband, a home, and a future. Instead, she found a ghost town, a blizzard, and a man bleeding out in the snow, a man who would change the fate of the entire territory. She didn't know his name, and she certainly didn't know that the dying stranger in her arms held the deed to the very land she stood on. This is the story of how a forgotten bride saved a king without a crown. The steam engine of the Northern Pacific Railway hissed and groaned, a dying mechanical beast exhaling its last breath of gray smoke into the crisp Montana air. The iron wheels screeched against the tracks, sending a shudder through the wooden floorboards of the passenger car. Susanna Miller unclenched her hands from her lap. Her knuckles were white, the skin chapped from the cold draft that had plagued the 3-day journey from St. Louis. She smoothed the wrinkles of her gray traveling dress, the only respectable garment she owned, and checked her reflection in the darkened window. Blue eyes, usually bright with determination, looked back at her, shadowed by exhaustion and a creeping, icy dread. Bitter Creek, the conductor bellowed, sliding the vestibule door open. Last stop for the mail. Bitter Creek. Susanna grabbed her carpet bag. It was light, terrifyingly so. It contained 2 changes of clothes, a Bible, a locket with a picture of her late mother, and a letter. The letter was signed by a man named Colton Maverick. I require a wife of sturdy constitution and honest character. I run a cattle operation of significant size. I cannot promise luxury, but I promise safety and a home. If you agree, ticket is enclosed. She stepped onto the platform. The wood was slick with early frost. She expected to see a bustling town, or at least a man holding a placard or looking for a woman in a gray dress. She saw nothing but wind-whipped dust and a station master who looked like he had been carved out of dried jerky. The train whistled, a lonely, mournful sound, and began to chug away, leaving Susanna standing alone in the vast, swallowing silence of the frontier. She walked toward the station master, clutching her bag. Excuse me, sir. I'm looking for Mr. Colton Maverick. The old man, whose name tag read Abernathy, looked up from his ledger. He squinted at her, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a brass spittoon near his boot. Maverick, you and half the territory, miss. I'm his wife. Well, his intended, Susanna corrected herself, her voice trembling slightly. He was supposed to meet me. Abernathy's eyebrows shot up. He stood, his joints cracking audibly. You're the mail-order gal? We heard talk, but he looked past her, scanning the empty horizon. Colt ain't been seen in town for 6 days, miss. Not since the dispute with the Rourke brothers heated up. Dispute? Susanna felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Range war, Abernathy said grimly. Tobias Rourke wants the water rights to the Triple M, Colt said over his dead body. The old man paused, his eyes softening with pity. If Colt Maverick ain't here to meet a pretty thing like you, it's likely because he's dead, miss. He's a man of his word. Susanna felt the blood drain from her face. She had spent her last dollar on food during the trip. She had no return ticket. She had nowhere to go back to, in street. Louis, having fled a life of destitute servitude. Where is the ranch? She asked, her voice stealing. She was a miller. Millers didn't faint, they endured. 30 miles north, Abernathy said, shaking his head. But you can't go there. Storm's brewing. A bad one. You can stay in the station tonight, but I can't stay here, Susanna said. If he's hurt, he needs help. If he's not, he owes me an explanation. She saw a livery stable across the dirt road. Does that stable rent horses? Buck does, Abernathy warned. But you riding into a blizzard to find a ghost is suicide. Susanna didn't listen. She marched across the street, the wind tearing at her bonnet. She traded her mother's gold locket, the only thing of value she possessed, for a sway-backed mare named Bessie, and a rough map drawn on the back of a supply invoice. As she rode out of Bitter Creek, the sky turned a bruised purple. The wind picked up, screaming through the canyons. Susanna Miller was city-bred, but she possessed a desperate courage. She rode toward the Triple M, not knowing that the man she was looking for wasn't at the ranch house. He was much closer, and he was dying. The snow began an hour after she left town. It wasn't a gentle dusting, it was an assault. The flakes were heavy and wet, sticking to Susanna's eyelashes and freezing her fingers to the reins. Bessie, the mare, plodded forward with her head down, trusting the instincts of an animal that knew the way home better than the rider. Visibility dropped to near zero. The map was useless now, dissolving in her wet pocket. Susanna was operating on blind faith and fear. I am going to die here, she thought, the realization cold and sharp. I traveled 2,000 miles to freeze to death in a ditch, just as she was about to turn back, or simply slide off the horse and curl up in the snow. Bessie shied violently, whinnying in terror. Easy, easy, girl. Susanna fought the reins, her heart hammering against her ribs. To her left, a dark shape loomed in the whiteout. It was a horse, saddled but riderless, standing motionless near a cluster of scrub oaks. Its reins were trailing on the ground, snagged on a dead branch. Susanna dismounted, sinking knee-deep into the drift. She waded toward the other horse. It was a massive black stallion, shivering, its coat matted with ice. On the saddle, the leather was stained dark. Blood. Is anyone there? Susanna screamed over the wind. Hello! No answer. Only the howl of the gale. She looked around frantically. If the horse was here, the rider had to be close. She followed the direction of the dragged reins back toward a steep drop-off, a ravine that cut through the landscape like a scar. Squinting, she saw a heap of denim and sheepskin violently contrasting with the pristine snow at the bottom of the slope, lodged against a fallen log. Susanna didn't think. She grabbed the rope from her saddle and tied it to a sturdy pine. Using it for leverage, she scrambled down the icy embankment, tearing her dress and scraping her palms raw. The man was lying face down. He was big, broad-shouldered, with long legs encased in leather chaps. A layer of snow had already begun to bury him. She rolled him over. He was unconscious, his face pale and gray beneath a heavy shadow of stubble. He was handsome, in a rugged, terrifying way, with a strong jaw and a scar running through his left eyebrow. But her focus was on his side. His sheepskin coat was soaked with blood just above the hip. Sir, she slapped his cold cheek. Sir, you have to wake up. He groaned, a low, guttural sound. But his eyes didn't open. Susanna looked up. There was no way she could lift a man of this size up the ravine. But she couldn't leave him. She remembered seeing a structure about a mile back, a dilapidated shack, likely used by line riders to check fences during the summer. It was her only chance. Okay, she whispered, her breath misting. Okay, we're going to move. She used the rope, tying it under his arms. It took every ounce of strength she possessed, and the help of the black stallion which she managed to coax to the edge of the ravine, to drag the unconscious man up the slope. It was a grueling, agonizing 30 minutes. By the time she had him draped over his horse, Susanna was weeping from exhaustion, her muscles burning as if they were on fire. She led the horses back through the storm, following her own tracks before the snow erased them. The line shack appeared out of the gloom like a sanctuary. It was barely a house, just 4 log walls, a stone hearth, and a dirt floor. But it had a door. She shoved the man inside, letting him slide from the saddle onto the hard earth. She quickly brought in the saddlebags and blankets, then led the horses into the small lean-to attached to the back of the shack to protect them from the wind. Inside, she barred the door. The cold was still biting, but the wind was gone. She worked by touch until she found a lantern hanging on a nail. Her hands shook as she struck a match. The flame flared, casting long, dancing shadows. She knelt beside the stranger. Now, in the light, she could see the damage. A gunshot wound. It had passed through the fleshy part of his side. It was messy, and he had lost a lot of blood. Who did this to you? She whispered. She stripped off his heavy coat and cut away his flannel shirt. He shivered violently, the early stages of hypothermia setting in. Susanna looked around the shack. There was a stack of dry wood. She started a fire, the smoke stinging her eyes. She found an old iron pot and filled it with snow, setting it on the flames to melt. She had no medicine. She had no doctor. She had only the skills she had learned nursing her father before he passed. She tore her petticoat, the fine lace she had saved for her wedding night, into strips. When the water boiled, she cleaned the wound. The man thrashed in his sleep, crying out a name she didn't recognize. Loretta. "Look out." "Shh," Susanna soothed, pressing a hot cloth to the wound to staunch the bleeding. "I've got you. You're safe." She worked for hours. She cauterized the wound with the heated blade of his own hunting knife, a gruesome task that made her vomit in the corner of the room afterwards. But the bleeding stopped. Night deepened. The storm raged outside, burying the world in white. Inside the tiny cabin, the fire crackled. Susanna was exhausted. She curled up on the dirt floor next to the stranger, sharing his buffalo robe to keep them both from freezing. She listened to his breathing, shallow but steady. She had come to Montana to be the mistress of a grand ranch. Instead, she was trapped in a shack with a nameless, gunshot cowboy, smelling of blood, smoke, and sweat. And as she drifted into a fitful sleep, she realized with a start that she had forgotten to be afraid. She held the stranger's callous hand in hers, anchoring him to the living world. She didn't know that the hand she held belonged to Colton Maverick, and she didn't know that by saving him, she had just placed a target on her own back. Sunlight, harsh and brilliant, stabbed through the cracks in the log walls. Susanna woke with a gasp, her body stiff and aching. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then, the smell of wood smoke and dried blood brought the memories rushing back. She sat up quickly. The man was still there. His eyes were open. They were gray, the color of a storm cloud, and they were fixed on her with intense, feverish suspicion. His hand was gripping the handle of the revolver she had placed on a crate nearby. "Who are you?" His voice was like grinding gravel. "And where is Rourke?" Susanna held up her hands, palms open. "My name is Susanna. I found you in the snow. You were shot." The man blinked, trying to clear the fog from his mind. He looked down at his side, seeing the pristine white bandages made from her petticoat. He touched them, wincing. You stitched me up?" "I did what I could," Susanna said, standing up and brushing the dirt from her ruined dress. "You lost a lot of blood. You shouldn't move." Colton Maverick stared at her. His head was pounding like a drum, but his mind was sharpening. Susanna. The name hit him like a physical blow. Susanna Miller, the mail-order bride. He remembered the letter. He remembered sending the money. God, that was months ago, before the range war with Tobias Rourke turned into a blood feud. He had completely forgotten she was coming. He was supposed to be at the station. Instead, he had been ambushed by Rourke's men at the canyon ridge. He looked at her. She was disheveled, her dress torn, her hair wild, circles of exhaustion under her eyes. She looked nothing like the delicate flower he expected from the city. She looked fierce. He opened his mouth to say, "I'm Colton Maverick. I'm your husband." But he stopped. If Rourke knew he was alive, he would finish the job. And if Rourke knew this woman was his intended bride, he would use her to get to the ranch. Tobias Rourke had no honor. He would hurt her just to break Colt. Colt made a decision in that split second. He couldn't tell her who he was. Not yet. Not until they were safe behind the fortified walls of the Triple M. For now, he was just a cowboy. "I'm Colt," he rasped, using only the nickname his hands used. Just a hand. "Well, Mr. Colt," Susanna said, moving to the fire to check the pot of water. "You are very lucky to be alive. Do you work for the Maverick Ranch?" "That's where I was heading." Colt stiffened. "Yeah, I work there. Why were you heading there?" Susanna's shoulders slumped. She looked into the fire. "I was supposed to meet the owner, Colton Maverick. We have an arrangement." "An arrangement?" Colt asked, testing her. Marriage, she said softly. But he wasn't at the station. The station master thinks he might be dead. She turned to look at Colt, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Is he? Is he a good man? Colt felt a pang of guilt sharp enough to rival the bullet wound. He's complicated, ma'am. Stubborn. Maybe a bit foolish. But is he alive? Last I saw him, he was breathing. Colt lied. But the ranch is dangerous right now. This Rourke fellow, he's trying to take the land. Before Susanna could respond, the sound of hoofbeats thundered outside. Not one horse, many. Colt's eyes went wide. He tried to sit up, groaning in pain. Put out the fire, he hissed. Now. Susanna didn't argue. She grabbed the pot of water and doused the flames. Steam hissed, filling the room with a damp gray fog. Get down, Colt whispered, pulling his revolver into his lap. He checked the cylinder. 2 rounds left. Voices drifted from outside. Rough, ugly voices. Tracks lead here, boss. Look, a woman's boot print. Susanna froze. She crawled next to Colt, her heart hammering against his arm. Burn it, a voice commanded. It was a smooth, oily voice. Tobias Rourke. If Maverick crawled in there, let's smoke him out. If it's just squatters, well, lesson learned. No, Susanna breathed. Colt looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, but no hysteria. She reached into her boot and pulled out a small, pearl-handled derringer. It was a toy compared to his peacemaker, but she held it steady. Colt felt a surge of admiration so strong it nearly knocked the wind out of him. This is her, he thought. This is the woman I need. Listen to me, Colt whispered, his lips inches from her ear. There's a trap door under the rug in the corner. Root cellar. You get in there. I'm not leaving you, she hissed back. I ain't dying today, Susanna, but I can't fight if I'm worrying about you. Get in the hole. The smell of kerosene wafted through the cracks in the door. Then, the sound of a match striking. Whoosh. The front of the cabin caught fire instantly. The dry wood, seasoned by years of sun, went up like kindling. Come out, Maverick, Rourke yelled. I know you're in there. I can smell the blood. Colt looked at Susanna. Trust me, he said. He kissed her. It was desperate, brief, and tasted of ash. Then he shoved her toward the corner. Susanna scrambled to the rug, threw it back, and found the wooden ring. She yanked the trapdoor open. It was a dark, damp pit. Go, Colt roared. She dropped into the darkness and pulled the heavy wood shut above her just as the front door of the cabin was kicked in. From the darkness of the cellar, Susanna heard the roar of gunfire, the shouting of men, and the sound of a body hitting the floor. Then, she heard nothing but the crackling of flames eating the world above her. She clamped her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face, praying to a god she thought had abandoned her. Please, let him live. Please. The heat was a living thing. It pressed down through the floorboards of the cabin, turning the root cellar into an oven. Susanna huddled in the corner of the damp pit, a handkerchief pressed over her mouth, coughing as wisps of acrid smoke curled through the cracks in the trapdoor. Above her, the world was ending. The roar of the fire was deafening, sounding like a freight train tearing through the forest. She heard the timber groan and snap, the heavy thud of the roof collapsing. She waited for death. She waited for the floorboards to give way and for the inferno to consume her. She prayed for the stranger Colt. Had he escaped? Or was his body currently burning in the ruins above her? Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time had no meaning in the dark. Eventually, the roar subsided to a crackle. The heat dissipated, replaced by a seeping cold that chilled the sweat on her skin. Susanna pushed tentatively against the trapdoor. It wouldn't budge. Debris, heavy logs, and stone had fallen on top of it. Panic, sharp and white-hot, spiked in her chest. Help, she croaked, her voice ruined by smoke. Is anyone there? Silence. She pushed again, bracing her back against the dirt wall and shoving with her legs. The wood groaned. A sliver of gray light pierced the darkness. She pushed harder, screaming with the effort, until the heavy beam above shifted just enough. Susanna clawed her way out, gasping for air. The cabin was gone. In its place was a blackened scar on the white landscape. Smoke spiraled lazily from the charred remains of the logs. The snow around the perimeter was melted into slush, stained black with ash. She stood up, her legs trembling. "Colt?" There was no answer. She scanned the clearing. There were hoofprints, many of them churned into the mud and snow, heading south. And there was blood, a trail of it leading away from the cabin door, disappearing into the churned earth where the horses had been. They had taken him, or killed him and dragged the body away. Susanna felt a sob rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. Tears would freeze on her face. She was alone in the Montana wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small, pearl-handled pistol with one bullet left. A low nickering sound broke the silence. Susanna spun around. Standing in the shelter of the lean-to, which had miraculously survived the worst of the fire due to the wind direction, was the black stallion. His coat was singed, and his eyes were rolling with fear, but he was alive. Bessie, her mare, was gone, likely spooked and ran off during the shooting. "You stayed," Susanna whispered, walking slowly toward the massive beast. "You waited for him." The horse stomped the ground, tossing its head. Susanna grabbed the reins. The saddle was still on him, though the leather was scorched. "I don't know where your master is," she told the horse, her voice trembling. "But I know where he lives. The Triple M. That's where we have to go." She mounted the stallion. It was like sitting on a powder keg. The animal was powerful, far too much horse for an inexperienced rider, but he seemed to sense her desperation. He didn't buck. "Home," she commanded, kicking his flanks. The horse took off. He didn't need guidance. He knew the way. They rode through the devastation of the storm's aftermath, navigating drifts that came up to the stirrups. Susanna clung to the saddle horn, freezing and exhausted, driven only by a singular, burning anger. Tobias Rourke had burned a man alive or worse. He had tried to kill her, and he was trying to steal a ranch she hadn't even seen yet. It took 4 hours to reach the valley floor. As they crested the final ridge, Susanna gasped. Below her, sprawled across thousands of acres of snow-dusted prairie, was not just a ranch. It was a kingdom. The Triple M was massive. A main house made of stone and timber stood 3 stories tall, with smoke puffing invitingly from 4 separate chimneys. There were barns the size of cathedrals, bunkhouses, corrals filled with cattle that looked like ants from this distance. A winding river cut through the property, glittering like a ribbon of silver. It was beautiful. It was intimidating. Susanna rode down the winding trail, her heart pounding. As she approached the main gate, a massive archway of rough-hewn logs branded with 3 M's, a group of riders intercepted her. 3 men, hard-faced, heavily armed. They drew their rifles as she approached. "Hold it right there," the lead rider shouted. He was an older man with a gray mustache and a face like tanned leather. "That horse, that's the boss's horse. Where did you get Obsidian?" Susanna pulled back on the reins. The stallion danced nervously. "My name is Susanna Miller," she announced, trying to project a regal air despite her soot-stained face and torn dress. "I am here to see Colton Maverick. I am his wife." The riders exchanged glances. The older man lowered his rifle slightly, squinting at her. "The mail-order bride? We thought you were stranded in Street Louis. The boss went to fetch you 3 days ago." "He found me," Susanna said, her voice cracking. "But we were ambushed. Rourke's men. They burned the line shack at Dead Man's Ridge." The color drained from the older man's face. "The shack burned? Where is Colton?" "I don't know," Susanna admitted, fighting back tears. "There was a man with me. He called himself Colt. He saved my life. He shoved me in the root cellar before they set the fire. When I came out, he was gone." There was blood. The rider cursed loudly. "Grady, ride back to the house. Get the boys. Tell them to saddle up. We're going to war." He turned back to Susanna. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I'm Silas, the foreman. If you're telling the truth, and Rourke has the boss. The boss? Susanna frowned. No. The man with me. He said he was a hand. Just a hand named Colt. Silas looked at her with a strange expression. Pity mixed with confusion. Ma'am, Silas said softly, Colt isn't a nickname for a hand. It's what his friends call him. You were with Colton Maverick. He owns all this. He owns the Triple M. The world tilted on its axis. Susanna gripped the saddle horn to keep from falling. The wounded man in the snow. The man she had stitched up. The man who had shielded her body with his own and kissed her before shoving her to safety. That wasn't a hired gun. That was him. He didn't tell me, she whispered. He wouldn't, Silas said grimly. Not if he thought you were in danger. Now come on, Mrs. Maverick. Let's get you inside. If Rourke has him, hell is about to come to Montana. The interior of the Triple M ranch house was a stark contrast to the brutal wilderness outside. The floors were polished oak, covered in thick Persian rugs. A chandelier made of elk antlers dominated the foyer. It smelled of beeswax, cedar, and old money. Susanna stood in the center of the great room, feeling like an intruder in her own life. A kind, round-faced housekeeper named Mrs. Higgins had bustled her into a warm bath, given her fresh clothes, a deep blue wool dress that fit surprisingly well and fed her hot stew. But Susanna couldn't rest. She paced the room, staring out the tall windows. You should sit, child, Mrs. Higgins urged, pouring tea. Silas and the boys will find him. They've been gone for 6 hours, Susanna said, wringing her hands. It's getting dark. Just then, the heavy oak front doors banged open. Wind and snow swirled into the foyer. Susanna spun around. Silas walked in first, his face grim. Behind him, 4 men were carrying a makeshift stretcher. Careful! Watch his leg, Silas barked. Susanna ran forward, her heart leaping into her throat. Is he alive? Silas grunted. Barely. Found him halfway down the canyon. Crawled 2 miles in the snow with a bullet in his gut. Tough son of a gun. They laid the stretcher on the long dining table. Susanna gasped. It was him. Colton Maverick looked like death. His skin was translucent, blue-veined and waxy. His clothes were shredded, and the bandage she had applied was soaked through with fresh blood. But his chest was rising and falling in shallow, hitching breaths. Get the doctor, Susanna commanded, her voice ringing with sudden authority. Doc's in town, Silas said. Blizzard cut the road. It'll be morning before he can get here. He won't last until morning, Susanna said. She looked at the wound. It had reopened during his crawl. Infection was setting in. She could smell the fever on him. She looked at the rough cowboys surrounding the table. They looked helpless, terrified of losing their leader. Boil water, Susanna ordered, rolling up the sleeves of the blue dress. Get me whiskey, a clean needle, and the sharpest knife you have. And more light. Now. The men hesitated for a second, looking to Silas. Do as she says, Silas roared. She's the mistress of the Triple M. For the next 4 hours, the dining room became an operating theater. Susanna worked with a focus that frightened even herself. She cleaned the wound again, deeper this time. She stitched the torn muscle. She forced whiskey down his throat when he groaned in consciousness. She was fighting for him. Not just because he was a human being, but because he had lied to her. He had pretended to be nothing while owning everything. He had saved her life without claiming the credit. She needed him to wake up so she could slap him and then kiss him. Around midnight, his fever broke. Susanna was sitting in a chair beside the table, her head resting on her arms, when she felt a hand touch her hair. She jerked awake. Colton's eyes were open. They were glassy, but the gray was focused. Susanna, he rasped. I'm here, she whispered, taking his hand. You're at the ranch. You're home. The ranch. He looked around, confusion clouding his gaze. Then realization dawned. He looked at her, guilt flickering in his eyes. You know? Yes, Mr. Maverick, she said, her voice cool but her grip on his hand tight. I know. You told me you were a hand. I had to, he wheezed. Rourke. If he knew, he would have used you. He tried to burn me alive anyway, Susanna said. You didn't have to face him alone. We were supposed to be partners. That was the agreement. I didn't want a partner, Colton murmured, his eyes drifting shut again. I just wanted someone to keep the house warm. Well, too bad, Susanna said, leaning close to his ear. Because you got a partner. And you are going to live to regret it. A ghost of a smile touched his cracked lips. Yes, ma'am. The moment was shattered by a heavy pounding on the front door. Silas marched in from the hallway, a Winchester rifle in his hand. Trouble, boss. It's the sheriff. And Rourke is with him. Colton's eyes snapped open. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory light. He tried to sit up, groaning. Stay down, Susanna hissed. Help me up, Colton commanded Silas. If Rourke is here, he's here to gloat. I won't let him see me on my back. Silas and another hand hoisted Colton up. He swayed, his face gray with pain, but he locked his knees and stood. He leaned heavily on the table, grabbing a revolver from the holster hanging on the chair. Open the door, Colton said. The doors swung open. Sheriff Brady, a man with shifting eyes and a weak chin, stood on the porch. Behind him, flanked by 6 armed men, stood Tobias Rourke. Rourke was a handsome man in a serpentine way, dressed in a pristine black suit that looked out of place in the wilderness. He smiled when he saw Colton, though his eyes narrowed at the sight of him standing. Colton, Rourke drawled. I heard there was a tragedy at the line shack. Fire. Terrible business. I came to pay my respects. To your memory. You missed, Colton said, his voice steady despite the agony tearing at his side. So I see, Rourke said, his smile tightening. But I have the sheriff here. We found a woman's belongings at the shack. A trespasser. We have reason to believe this woman caused the fire that destroyed my timber rights. Your timber rights? Colton laughed, a harsh barking sound. That's Maverick land, Rourke. Disputed land, Rourke corrected. And until the court decides, it's under jurisdiction. Sheriff, arrest the girl for arson and trespassing. The sheriff stepped forward nervously. Now, Colt. Be reasonable. The lady needs to come in for questioning. Susanna stepped out from behind Colton. She stood tall, the blue dress rustling. I am not a trespasser, she said clearly. Her voice carried over the wind. Rourke looked her up and down, a sneer forming on his lips. And who might you be, darling? One of Colt's saloon girls? I am Susanna Maverick. She lied, or perhaps prophesied. I am his wife. And I was on my husband's property. The only arsonist I saw was you, Mr. Rourke. I saw you strike the match. Silence descended on the porch. Rourke's face went dangerously still. Wife? Colton Maverick isn't married. Colton wrapped a heavy arm around Susanna's waist, pulling her flush against his side. The pain was blinding, but he didn't flinch. We were married by proxy in Street Lewis. Colton lied smoothly. She's the mistress of this house. And if you step 1 foot closer to her, sheriff or no sheriff, I will bury you where you stand. He cocked the hammer of his revolver. Behind him, Silas and 5 other ranch hands leveled their Winchesters. The standoff lasted a long, suffocating minute. Rourke tipped his hat. Well then, congratulations to the happy couple. I suppose this changes legalities. He turned his horse. We'll be seeing you, Mrs. Maverick. Winter is long. Accidents happen. They rode off into the night. As soon as they were gone, Colton's knees buckled. Susanna caught him, crumbling to the floor with him under his weight. You fool, she whispered, cradling his head in her lap. You stubborn, impossible fool. Had to claim you, he mumbled, drifting into unconsciousness. Couldn't let him take you. 2 weeks passed. The blizzard had buried the valley in 5 feet of snow, effectively locking the Triple M off from the rest of the world. It was a strange, suspended time. Susanna spent her days running the household, a task Mrs. Higgins yielded to her, with surprising relief, and her nights nursing Colton. The recovery was slow. The fever came and went. In his delirium, Colton talked. He talked about his father, who built the ranch with blood and iron. He talked about the loneliness of the high plains. He talked about her, Susanna. Soft hands. Too good for here. Run away, girl. She listened, changing his bandages, sponging his forehead. She learned the landscape of his body, the scars, the calluses, the strength that lay dormant beneath the injury. And he learned her. When he was awake, he watched her with an intensity that made her blush. He saw that she wasn't delicate. She argued with Silas about feed rations. She organized the pantry. She read to him in the evenings from his small library, her voice steady and calming. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth of the master bedroom, Colton tried to stand up. "What are you doing?" Susanna scolded, dropping her sewing. "I can't lie here anymore," he grumbled. He was wearing trousers and a loose shirt, leaning heavily on a cane Silas had whittled for him. "I feel like a gelding." "You are healing," she corrected. He hobbled over to the window, staring out at the moonlight on the snow. "Rourke has been quiet. Too quiet. Maybe he gave up," Susanna suggested, though she didn't believe it. "Rourke doesn't give up. He waits." Colton turned to her. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his face. He looked dangerous again, and breathtakingly masculine. "Susanna, we need to talk about the lie." "Which one?" she asked, standing up. "The marriage. I told the sheriff we were married. In the eyes of the law, if they check the records in Street Louis, or the county seat, they'll know we aren't. Rourke will use that. He'll claim you have no right to be here. He could have you deported back east. Or worse, arrested for fraud." Susanna felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty window. "So, what are you saying? Do you want me to leave?" Colton stepped closer. He dropped the cane. He winced, but took another step until he was inches from her. "No," he said, his voice rough. "I don't want you to leave. I want to make it true." Susanna's breath hitched. "You want to marry me? To save the ranch?" "To save you," he said. He reached out, his rough thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "And because I don't want to wake up in a house where you aren't." It wasn't a flowery declaration of love. It was a practical, Western admission of need. And for Susanna, it was enough. "Okay," she whispered. "Tonight," Colton said. "The circuit judge is stuck at the bunkhouse. He rode in before the storm hit to wait it out. We do it now." The ceremony was hasty. It took place in the great room, by the fire. Silas and Mrs. Higgins were the witnesses. The judge, a man named Judge Pembroke who smelled of gin and old tobacco, read the words from a tattered book. Susanna wore her blue dress. Colton wore his best black coat, favoring his left leg. "Do you, Susanna Miller, take this man?" "I do." When Colton kissed her, it wasn't the desperate, ash-tasted kiss of the burning shack. It was deliberate, possessive. His lips were warm, and for a moment, the war with Rourke, the snow, and the danger faded away. But the peace was short-lived. The next morning, the sky was a brilliant, hard blue. Susanna was in the kitchen, rolling dough, wearing the heavy gold ring Colton had taken from his mother's jewelry box. It felt heavy on her finger. "Mrs. Maverick." Silas burst through the back door. He didn't knock. "Boss, where's the boss?" Colton limped into the kitchen, his revolver already in his hand. "What is it?" "The water," Silas gasped. "The creek. It stopped running." Colton cursed. "The dam." "Rourke?" Susanna asked, wiping flour from her hands. "He's dammed the creek upstream," Colton said, his face darkening with a rage that terrified her. "He's cutting off the water to the herd. The cattle will be dead in 3 days if we don't break that dam." "But that's on his land," Silas said. "If we ride up there and blow it, we're trespassing. He'll have the legal right to shoot us down." "He's counting on that," Colton said. He looked at Susanna. "He wants to draw me out. He knows I can't ride hard yet. He wants me to send the boys so he can pick them off, or he wants me to come myself so he can finish what he started. You can't go, Susanna said firmly. You'll tear your stitches. I have to, Colton said. Those cattle are everything. My father's legacy. Then I'm going with you, Susanna said. Absolutely not. I'm a maverick now, aren't I? Susanna argued, untying her apron. And I'm the one person he can't shoot. Not with the sheriff watching. Why? Colton asked. Because, Susanna said, her mind racing, forming a plan. Because I'm going to invite the sheriff to tea. Colton stared at her. You're crazy. No, she said. I'm a distraction. While I keep the sheriff and Rourke occupied with legal papers and proof of our marriage at the boundary line, you and Silas take the back trail to the dam. It was a dangerous plan. It relied on Rourke's arrogance and his interest in humiliating Susanna. An hour later, they rode out. Susanna rode Obsidian, the black stallion, looking every inch the queen of the Triple M. She rode openly toward the boundary line where Rourke's men were guarding the makeshift dam. Colton and Silas took a team of 6 men, carrying dynamite, circling through the treacherous scree of the canyon walls to get behind the enemy lines. Susanna halted her horse at the fence line. Rourke was there, sitting on a pale gray gelding, watching her approach. Mrs. Maverick, Rourke sneered. Come to beg for water? I came to negotiate, Susanna said loudly, and to show the sheriff my marriage certificate. Unless, of course, you're afraid of a piece of paper? Rourke laughed. Let her through, boys. Let's see what the little lady has to say. Susanna rode into the enemy camp. She was the bait in a trap made of dynamite in desperation. She kept her eyes on Rourke, but her ears were straining for the sound of a fuse hissing in the distance. She just hoped Colton could move fast enough. Because if the dam blew while she was standing here, Rourke would kill her before the water even hit the valley floor. The air at the boundary line was so cold it felt like inhaling broken glass. Susanna sat atop the massive black stallion, Obsidian, keeping him steady with a firm hand despite the trembling in her own knees. Tobias Rourke sat across from her on his gray gelding, a cigar clamped between his teeth. He looked at the marriage certificate Susanna held out, but he didn't take it. He just smirked, his eyes scanning the ridgeline behind her. A piece of paper doesn't make water flow, Mrs. Maverick, Rourke drawled, and it doesn't move my property line. This dam is illegal, Susanna stated, her voice projecting clearly for the benefit of Sheriff Brady, who sat nervously on his horse nearby. You are deliberately starving our cattle. That is a crime, Sheriff. Is it not? The sheriff shifted in his saddle, tugging at his collar. Now, ma'am. Mr. Rourke says it was a rock slide. Nature's doing. Hard to prove otherwise. A rock slide that stacked logs perfectly horizontal? Susanna countered, gesturing to the blockage upstream. A rock slide that happened the day after you threatened my husband? Rourke's eyes narrowed. He guided his horse closer, invading her space. You have a sharp tongue for a mail-order bride. Colton should have taught you better. Maybe I will. Susanna didn't flinch, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Just a little longer, she prayed. Just give him a few more minutes. My husband is a man of honor, Susanna said, locking eyes with the villain. Something you wouldn't understand. He built the Triple M with his own hands. You're just a scavenger. Rourke's face flushed a deep, angry red. Careful, girl. Accidents happen out here. Horses spook. People fall. He reached out, his hand closing over the reins of her stallion near the bit. It was a threat. Plain and simple. Let go, Susanna warned. Or what? Rourke sneered. Where is he? Hiding in the ranch house, nursing his gut? He sent a woman to do a man's job. Boom. The sound wasn't a noise. It was a concussion. It ripped through the canyon, shaking the ground so violently that the sheriff's horse reared, throwing the lawman into a snowbank. Rourke froze, his head snapping toward the dam. A plume of smoke, dirt, and splintered timber rose into the sky like a mushroom cloud. For a second, there was silence. Then, A roar. The water, held back for weeks, was free. It surged through the breach in a frothing, brown wall, tossing aside logs and boulders as if they were twigs. "You witch!" Rourke screamed, realizing he'd been played. He yanked hard on Obsidian's reins, trying to pull Susanna off the saddle, intending to use her as a shield or perhaps just to hurt her in his fury. Susanna didn't panic. She remembered what Colton had told her about the stallion. "He's war-trained. If you're in trouble, give him his head." Susanna dropped the reins and grabbed the saddle horn. "Hia!" she screamed, kicking the stallion's flanks. Obsidian didn't run away. He reared, striking out with his front hooves. One massive hoof caught Rourke's gray gelding on the shoulder. The gray screamed and bolted, throwing Rourke backward into the slush. "Sheriff!" Susanna yelled, pointing at the wreckage of the dam. Look at the logs!" The rushing water had washed the debris down to their feet. Bobbing in the foam were massive timber beams, clearly branded on the ends with a searing iron mark. "M.M. Those are Maverick logs," Susanna shouted over the roar of the water. "He stole our timber to build the dam. That proves it was no rock slide. That's theft and sabotage." Sheriff Brady, scrambling to his feet, looked at the logs, then at Rourke, who was struggling to stand in the freezing mud, his fine suit ruined. The evidence was undeniable. The water had washed away the lies. "Rourke!" the sheriff barked, finally finding his spine. "Stay right there." But Rourke wasn't done. He pulled a derringer from his vest pocket, leveling it at Susanna. His eyes were wild, filled with the madness of a man who had lost everything. "If I go down," Rourke hissed, "I'm taking the bride with me." A gunshot cracked through the air. Susanna flinched, waiting for the pain. But it wasn't her who was hit. The pistol flew from Rourke's hand, spinning into the mud. Rourke clutched his wrist, howling. Susanna spun around. On the ridge above, silhouetted against the sun, sat Colton Maverick. He was leaning heavily on his saddle horn, his face pale as death, smoke curling from the barrel of his Winchester rifle. Silas and the boys were behind him. Colton guided his horse down the slope, sliding through the scree. He looked like a vengeful god. He rode straight up to Rourke, who was cowering in the mud. Colton didn't say a word. He just looked at the man who had tried to burn him, starve his cattle, and kill his wife. He cocked the lever of his rifle. "Don't, Colton," Susanna said softly. Colton looked at her. His gray eyes were hard, but they softened when they met hers. "He's not worth the hangman's noose," Susanna said. "Let the law have him. Let him rot in a cell, knowing a woman beat him." Colton held Rourke's gaze for a long moment, then slowly lowered the rifle. He looked at the sheriff. "Get him off my land, Brady, before I change my mind." The sheriff scrambled to handcuff the weeping Rourke. Colton groaned, swaying in his saddle. The adrenaline was fading, and the pain of his reopened wound was returning. Susanna slid off Obsidian and ran to him, grabbing his leg to steady him. "You aim straight for a dying man," she said, tears finally spilling over. "I aim straight when it matters," Colton rasped. He reached down, his gloved hand cupping her cheek. "You did good, Mrs. Maverick. You saved the herd." "We saved the herd," she corrected. Colton smiled, a true, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Let's go home, Susanna. I think I need you to stitch me up again. I'm charging you extra this time," she sobbed, burying her face in his coat. "Deal," he whispered. Spring came late to Montana that year, but when it arrived, it was glorious. The Bitterroot Valley exploded in wildflowers, purple lupine and yellow balsamroot painting the hills. The Triple M was thriving. The cattle were fat, the river was running clear, and the scars of the fire at the line shack were hidden by new growth. On the porch of the main house, Susanna sat in a rocking chair, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and violet. She was sewing a quilt, incorporating scraps of a torn gray traveling dress and a blue wool gown. The door opened, and Colton stepped out. He walked without a cane now, though he still had a slight hitch in his step when the weather turned cold. He held 2 glasses of lemonade. He handed one to her and sat on the railing, looking out over his empire. But he wasn't looking at the land. He was looking at her. "Abernathy at the station told me something today," Colton said. "Oh?" Susanna smiled. "And what did that old gossip say?" "He said another train came in from Street Lewis. Said a man was asking about mail-order brides. Abernathy told him to turn right back around." "Why?" "He told him the only bride worth having in Montana was already taken," Colton said, his voice low and warm. "He told him she walked through a blizzard, pulled a dead man out of a canyon, and stared down the devil himself." Susanna laughed. "He makes me sound like a tall tale." "You are a tall tale, Susanna," Colton said. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, lingering kiss that tasted of lemonade and promises kept. "But you're my real life, and I thank God every day that I was the one bleeding in that snowbank. You own the largest ranch in the territory. Colton Maverick," she whispered against his lips. "But don't you ever forget who owns you." Colton chuckled, pulling her into his arms as the first stars appeared over the Triple M. "I wouldn't dream of it." And that is the story of Susanna Miller and Colton Maverick. What started as a desperate journey for a mail-order bride turned into a battle for survival, a war for land, and a love forged in the fires of adversity. Susanna didn't just find a husband. She found her own strength, proving that sometimes the person who needs saving isn't the damsel in distress, but the cowboy who thinks he can face the world alone. If you enjoyed this story of romance, danger, and justice in the Wild West, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel. Don't forget to share this with a friend who loves a good love story, and hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss out on our next adventure. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next trail.